Hi everyone. This is a lecture over common measurements in exercise physiology. This is probably your first lecture that you're kind of looking at. These PowerPoints that we're going to go through in all of these lectures are available to you on your learning management software. Um, and these lectures kind of go over briefly these things. We'll go in depth on some things, and other things we'll kind of skim over the things that you can probably easily figure out on your own. But in addition to this, you have other videos and lectures you can watch that give background or give more information or are given by people who probably know the material better than I do. So we'll kind of dive in and get through this one, and then kind of a similar pattern will follow for the rest of our lectures for this course. And the chapters do correspond with your book. First thing to kind of talk about is unit of measurement. So exercise physiology is a science. It's based in a lot of numbers as well. And so units of measure are a big thing. So we have the metric system, which most people have heard of. Think kind of kilograms, centimeters, meters, that type of thing. And in the United States, we tend to use the English system. So things like pounds and miles and feet and inches. And so that can sometimes get confusing, and a lot of the things that you'll read and the equations you'll do and a lot of things you'll see in science are based on the metric system. And so kind of getting that together, you're going to start getting used to having to jump back and forth between metric and the English system, because that's what people that you're most likely working with will understand. But there's also confusion sometimes in the science world, and so they've developed a system of international units that is a commonly accepted kind of set of measurements for specific things, and we'll look at that here in just a second. There are, for the metric system, remember, kind of prefixes that kind of tell you where you're at in relative to the base. So meter versus centimeter, like what's that difference? 1 meter is how much of a centimeter, and these are good to get familiar with. Don't go too much into the mega, a little bit into the nano or pico if you get into some very small micro kind of biology or microchemistry stuff, but really we're staying in this kind of general area here. But when it comes to those important SI units that you'll kind of hear referred to a lot of, things like mass and distance or time, there are standard kind of measurements for that. So kilograms, meters, seconds. If you're looking at work, it's typically in joules. If it's power, it's watts. And so you'll see some of these things come up again and again as you go through this semester and beyond. And then you'll also see some things like we'll talk about today, how power could also be measured in other ways that make more sense for its application, and you may have to convert between the two. And so it's just good to kind of recognize what these units are when you're talking about, certain things like energy or power and what those correspond to the SI unit, depending on that measurement. So a couple of things we just want to mention, things like work. Work is defined as force times distance. So if someone's talking about work, it's actually doing something with that, not just creating a force, but actually causing some kind of change to occur, typically a distance. And so we're looking at meters. And then there are things here. So there are going to be examples throughout this PowerPoint that show you how that math works. And it's good to know that and be able to follow along with it. They break it down really well step by step. So take some time to look at those and understand, kind of how they're getting these numbers and the conversions, and that you could work yourself through an equation similar to this. I don't plan on giving you any kind of crazy math problems, but it is good to understand these because as you move forward, some of these will become helpful for you. And so when we look at this, something called a Kilopond Meter is a way that is measuring kind of work or joules in the world of exercise physiology, or kilocalories, which is 1,000 calories. So think calories with the food you eat. So it's a measurement of energy as well. So kind of the joules. And so you can see these different kind of conversions on how to get from one to the other. And so this would be a good reference sometimes to go back to if you're looking at some of the math problems further in your book or as you move on. And so again, we kind of have power. Power is work divided by time, so how long it takes you to do something. So joules divided by seconds, and that's usually watts. So another good measurement to kind of look at. And again, just gives you some of that basic math on how to get there. And then common units for expressing power. So you've got watts, you've got horsepower, and then you've got these kilopond meters. So different ways to look at kind of the same thing, depending on when it was created and what we're actually looking at. So horsepower, most people think of cars. Um, and then in kilopond meters, that's kind of an exercise work rate that then can be converted in watts when you flip it over to, let's say, a computer, because we get watts of electricity is typically how we think about that. And so ways to convert those two. And so one thing to look at when the measurement of work and power in the exercise world is we tend to think about something called ergometry, which is just simply a way to measure work output. So ergometry is a way for us to measure how much in an exercise world, how much work you're putting out. And typically we do this with an ergometer. So it's something that will measure that for us, a device used to measure work. And so you have different types of ergometers. One common one would be something like a cycle ergometer. So typically think of a bike. So a bike is a cycle ergometer. A lot of times when people are biking, they're not thinking about measuring the work they're putting out, and they're not designed to do that. But there are pieces of equipment that we can take and measure exactly how much work someone's putting out as they're sitting on a cycle or a bike and pedaling, and how much resistance is there. We can measure those things. A treadmill can do the same thing. Not all of treadmills are designed to give us this measure of work, but it can be done on all of them, and some specifically give that measurement nice and easy. So it's something that gets used quite a bit in the exercise physiology world. And so when we go through here, this is kind of talking about EPOC, which we'll talk about this semester. Excess post-oxygen consumption is greater following high-intensity exercise. Why? Well, and that's because we're needing to use more of our muscle mass in order for us to produce more work. So think on a treadmill. If we start out slow, we're not having to use too much of our muscles to go that slow walking speed. But if we start to run, we're going to use more of our muscles to get ourselves faster and faster and keeps ourselves going. And so we're going to use more of that energy, produce more work. And so what the next few slides go at, might be a lot. Again, I'll let you work on this. You guys are smart students, but it simply goes through and gives you examples of how we figure out the power through different things. So a bench step calculation, so someone stepping up on a box and stepping down, kind of like climbing stairs, we can actually figure out how much work someone's putting in, how much power they're putting in, based on different calculations that have been corrected. And these work you through that. They give you information on the subject and what they're doing, and then kind of walk you through the different conversions and equations to get you to the point of being able to see, well, this person was putting out 103 watts of energy or of power with this particular workout. And it walks you through things like a cycle ergometer, so a bike. It walks you through treadmill calculations and the fact that the grade or the incline matters, and how fast that's going. And so a lot that goes into that. And so it's just, again, giving you this idea of the fact that exercise is math-based, and we can put a lot of math around it, and yet there are things in it that aren't always as easily calculated as well, and it'll talk about that. And so it goes into treadmill calculations and how we can calculate how many kilojoules of work are done, or kind of that wattage as well, so you can convert any of those as you move forward. And so really why these are important, why to know how much output and work is done is, we can start measuring intensity and start comparing people. But when we can start measuring how much work is done, we can also start looking at different ways to measure energy output and starting combining those to how much energy does it take to get how much work. And so we can then convert that over into how many calories have you burned during this exercise, is kind of the initial way to think about it. And so when we're looking at that, we do have to be able to tell, well, yeah, we know that you have put out this certain amount of work. You've created 100 watts of energy working on a bicycle, or this many joules on a treadmill. But that's great, but how much energy did the body actually burn? So it's kind of the difference between when you're driving a car. You can say, well, I know that I drove 20 miles at 50 miles an hour in a car. But then at the same time, well, how much gas did that take? And depending on the car you're in, those are going to be different answers, right? Um, a little economy car might, have burned a gallon of gas, where a truck may have burned 2 or 3 gallons of gas. And so we need a way to measure that fuel consumption. And so that's done with what's called calimetry. And there are two different types of calimetry. There's direct and indirect. And so realize that calimetry is simply the measurement of heat production as an indication of metabolic rate. So how much food how much energy you're burning. And so energy in our bodies is considered, typically we think about it as food or foodstuffs. And when we combine food and O2 in the body, we get ATP, which is our energy source. It's what we're going to use to move and do things in our body. But we're also going to create heat. And our ATP, and that ATP is then going to go to our cells to perform work, so like a muscle contraction, and we're going to produce more heat. And if we can measure that heat coming off of the body, we can actually figure out how much, we can figure out the metabolic rate, which is how much energy you're actually utilizing. And so there's some basic, common measurements for calories here. So we think of calories like in our food, like it has 100 calories in it. Well, sometimes when you get to bigger calculations over time, you want to look at kilocalories, which is just simply 1,000 calories, and the fact that 1,000 calories is equal to 4,186 joules, which is again a measure of that energy, that work that's being done. And so we can start converting and looking at this in multiple ways. Now, some of you might be saying, well, how do we measure heat that someone gives off? Wouldn't that be pretty hard? And it's not the easiest thing to do. And so this is a simple diagram of how you would measure direct calimetry or someone's metabolic rate directly. It's really expensive. It's not a lot of places have the capabilities of doing it because there's a lot that goes into it. And so what happens is you would literally put someone in this kind of box, if you want to say, and this box is covered in a layer of water. So there's water going all around this box. It's a jacket of water, kind of said right here, going around. And that person goes in this box, and they can actually be the size of a full room, and they would go about their normal daily business. Air comes in, air goes out. And over time, what's going to happen is that water surrounding this room or this box is going to heat up, and we can measure that over time. So you take how much water there is and how hot it's gotten, how many degrees Celsius it's increased, and you can actually do the conversion to figure out how much energy they've produced through this heat. And that's direct calimetry, but that's not necessarily practical for the real world. It's expensive and hard to do. But it's good that we have that, because that allowed us to develop what we call indirect calimetry, which is being able to measure the same kind of joules being given off and the work that the body's doing and how much energy we're using, but not in a way that's so confined where we have to control for heat, because you got to think anything else that produces heat that goes in that room has to be calculated for. So if you take your phone in that room with you, well, we've got to figure out how much heat your phone's putting off, because it is putting off some heat. Everything's putting off heat. And so indirect calimetry is a measurement of oxygen that your body is utilizing as an indirect method of how much heat you're going to put off. And so what happens is we know that the food you eat plus some O2 inside of your body is going to create heat, it's going to create CO2, and it's going to create water. And so what happens is you can actually take and figure out how much oxygen you breathe in versus how much oxygen you breathe out with every breath. And if we do this over time, we can actually figure out how much oxygen your body is using to take food and create heat and energy and water. And so this is indirect calimetry. And so some basic things come where we start figuring out that for every liter of pure oxygen, so not just liter of air, but of pure oxygen that your body is able to turn into heat, ATP, CO2, and water, for every liter that your body's able to do that, that's 5 kcals that you have used. And so we start getting into that kind of measurement that you were looking at earlier. So it depends on a few things, but for every liter of oxygen you consume, that's 5 kcals. And so this particular version of 5 kcals is, think 5 calories. So it's kind of a little different than but if you eat a 5 calorie, like cut off a 5 calorie piece of whatever, maybe a carrot, a 5 calorie carrot. For every liter of O2 that you consumed, you've burned that carrot off. And so over time with certain equipment, we can figure out how much oxygen you've consumed. So if you consume 2 liters of oxygen every single minute doing some activity, well, that means you're basically burning 10 calories every single minute. And that's helpful for us. And so what they call this is typically open circuit spirometry. So there are devices like this one in the picture. You kind of get hooked up to this computer. And what happens is you breathe in room air. It goes into your lungs. You utilize that oxygen, and then you breathe out. So room air is about 20% oxygen. The air that you breathe out is around 16% oxygen, so you're using about 4% of it. And it goes into this device right here, and it measures how much you breathe in and out. So it's measuring how much air you're moving, and it's also analyzing that gas to see how much oxygen you actually utilized from it. And then what happens is all that goes into a computer, and it gets transferred into how many liters of oxygen you're consuming with every single breath, which is really nice and gives us all of this information. And then you can start utilizing this information with someone's mass and their ventilation rates. And what you can see what the machine does is takes all this into account, how much they're moving, so ventilation, how much air you're moving per minute, the inspired O2 versus the expired O2. And so there's about a 4% difference, and you're consuming 60 liters of air. So that's not oxygen, that's air. And so we can then kind of figure out how much oxygen you're actually utilizing when it comes to that, which is about 4% of this 60. And that's what this kind of works you into as you go through. So every single minute you're consuming about 2.4 liters per minute based on this, whatever this activity that they're doing. And so then we can start figuring out from there, based on these things, how many calories are they burning per minute, which is what people start caring about in the real world. How many calories? So if I run at this intensity for 5 minutes, how many calories am I going to burn? Well, in this particular instance, this work rate that they were doing that we've calculated, they're burning 12 calories a minute. So if they did it for 5 minutes, they'd burn 60 calories. And then we can start using that for various things on how much they need to eat so they don't lose weight, or how much they need to exercise to lose weight, depending on what the goal is of that particular person. And so one way that people have converted this to make it easier for everyday individuals to figure things out like this is what's called METs, or metabolic equivalents. You are burning energy just sitting here right now listening to this video around 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of your body weight per minute is what we kind of do while we're resting. And so what people have done, not we, I've not done it, but individuals have done is looked at common exercises and figured out about how many METs is that. So how many resting equivalents is that? So let's say a jog, for example, might be considered 2 METs of activity or 3 METs of activity. And so that means you're burning 2 to 3 times the amount of oxygen. You're utilizing 2 to 3 times the amount of oxygen you are while sitting at rest. And so it's just a quick way to measure how much energy some particular activity is taking, and they can be useful. And so then it goes on to say, talks about how to estimate energy expenditure with certain things, with not having to actually measure this oxygen consumption based on what other people have done. They've come up with equations where we can figure out how much energy you or I or anyone's burning during common modes of transportation. So biking, walking, running tend to be the top 3, but there are others as well. And the book kind of talks about how there's this relationship of our VO2 and this volume of oxygen consumed and the activity we do and how much energy we expend. And it starts breaking those down. The fact that running and walking are different. So you can see these lines are slightly different. They're slightly different at their slope. So walking, as the intensity goes up, our walking speed goes up, we do see this rise in how much oxygen we're utilizing, how much energy it takes. And then at running, for every little bit of speed that we increase, that amount of energy needed to do that goes up at a quicker rate. And then we have this kind of gap in here. And this is where the science knows things, but there are individual differences. So you can see that there's a difference in this speed right here where the line, there is no line. And that's because we're all a little bit different. What's walking for me might be running for you, depending on our heights and our stride lengths and how we're doing those things. And so there is a gray area of when that is utilized. And that's always important to realize, is that you are working with individuals who are different across the board, and there will always be differences in these. But there are some good estimates that you can utilize for that. And so it kind of gives you the equation for several of these, walks you through what those look like and the different measurements and why those may be. And I would encourage you to look at these. And so it even goes into the cycling on watts and all of that. It's great kind of conceptual things for you to see as you're moving forward. But one other thing to note is something called exercise efficiency. So exercise efficiency is how much work or how much energy work you're outputting, so how much you're actually doing versus the energy that you input. So how efficient are you at utilizing the energy inside your body that you're creating? And there are several ways to do that. You're usually looking for a percentage work output over energy expended. And it gives you some just an idea of, like, when you go on a cycle or you're biking, that energy efficiency is 15 to 27% is all you're getting. So when you're biking, around 75 to 80% of all the energy you create is being lost as heat or other various things, and only about 15 to 27% is being transferred into the work you're actually doing. And so just kind of keeping that in mind, it goes through and gives you some calculation, talks about the things that may affect it. So the intensity, the speed of the movement, what kind of muscles you're using, which we'll talk about this semester. And you can see as things get faster, as we have to move faster and faster, tends to be our efficiency goes down on something like an arm crank or an arm ergometer, so an arm bike. And it's all different depending on the muscles we're using and what those muscles are used to doing and how well trained we are, so this can change over time. But what's really cool is if you look at the effects of speed on net efficiency. And so when you're looking at this, what you can see is there's an optimal speed where we're the most efficient. And if we go faster than that, we lose efficiency. If we're slower than that, we lose efficiency. So there are kind of these areas where we are the most efficient. So we're getting the most bang for our buck for the energy that we're utilizing. And same thing goes for running versus cycling. And the fact that we talked about, hey, this can change. Well, this chart just shows us that when we look at someone, so this is a slightly different measurement than what we've been talking about. So VO2, instead of being every single minute, this is per kilometer. So we're showing how much oxygen you are utilizing to travel 1 kilometer per your body weight. So we can compare people of different sizes. And what you see is that an elite runner can be 10% more efficient than someone who's untrained. So it's taking an untrained individual 10% more energy to travel a kilometer than someone of the same size that is an elite runner. And so your body becomes better at utilizing the energy it makes, which is the whole goal of performance enhancing through exercise and through training, is to make your muscles more efficient, and so they can do it for longer or do it for faster using that same amount of energy. And so that kind of sums up this chapter. If you guys have any questions, please let me know. But hopefully this is a good kind of intro into it, and then we'll quickly start ramping up into some more specifics and some of the more science stuff in here as well.